I want to just take a moment to thank John Brody for having filled in so well the last couple of weeks for Jeff. And John, just thank you. But it's wonderful to have you back, Jeff. That's the big point. And back healthy. We were all worried. So good to have you back. Before I start my Devar Torah, and again, I always look for things to have gratitude for. There's a wonderful article in the New York Times Magazine section a couple weeks ago by Emily Bazelon, who's a professor at Yale, writes a lot for the New York Times. Her dad was one of the great judges in this country. He was in the DC Federal Court of Appeals. But it's about how this election actually worked. With all the obstacles, the head of the Postal Service trying to close it down so they couldn't have the absentee ballots. And after reading the article, I realized again how we all are in this together, how we're all interconnected. And it took the labor of tens of thousands of people to make this election work. And I'll just give you one example. I'm only going to read one page. This is about a place called Renbeck Election Services in Phoenix. You may be Avivit. And there they have these huge printing presses. They're able to churn out 2 million ballots in 24 hours. The people who ran the machines worked overtime. In this sprawling warehouse, they hired as many as 90 temporary workers to join each 12-hour shift printing the November ballots. There were no weekends. Many printers worked for over 40 consecutive days. It wasn't unheard of for employees to log 130 hours of overtime in a single 2-week period. It almost sounds inconceivable that you would have 65 hours of overtime in a week. And that's the dedication. So many people, whether it was counting the ballots. It's a wonderful article by Emily and well worth a read. But it didn't just happen. When we read this week's Torah portion, as most of the Torah portions, you'll note that almost everything that happens is attributed to God. And I just hear it says, Rachel couldn't have a child. She goes to Jacob, says, Jacob, help me out here. He says, it's up to God whether you have a child. So she gives him her maid, Bilhah. He consorts with Bilhah and he has a child and they give credit to God. So I want to start off with a question. How many think that God plays a role in the good that happens in this world? If so, please raise your hand. Basha. John. Got the Brodies together, good. Anybody else raise your hand saying that you think God plays a role in the good in the world? Good. Ellen and Lester. Oh, no, Avivit, good. Bill.
I would say I hope. I have no way of knowing.
Okay. Anybody else feel that God plays that, but you actually believe that God does?
I don't know.
Okay.
I hope God does. I mean, does anyone know?
Some people believe very strongly that God does.
On what basis?
Well, we're going to talk today, but anybody feel that God does not play a role in what happens in this world? Karen, good. Robin. How many think that God plays a role in the bad that happens in this world? Karen, are you saying yes?
I'm in Bill's court. Who knows?
So it's who knows. Okay. Roberta, what were you going to say?
I'm with Bill and Karen.
I want to thank all those who are supporting me.
Well, I always support you, but be that as it may. Yeah,
And Bill, I'll support you also.
I
Me
think
too.
I'm in that camp. I'm not sure if there is a God, so I can't give him.
So
or her-
lots of questions. It raises questions is what you're saying.
yeah.
So there were a couple articles in the newspaper recently. And then I want to really, because I think it's, if you, again, we read the Torah, it's no question. There's God's involved in almost everything that happens. Good, not good. Lot's wife turns around, God zaps her, turns into a pillar of salt. Again, these are myths from my perspective, but there's still, God plays a very active role. So the first story, it's a fascinating story too. Martin Luther King has just finished his first pulpit in Montgomery, Alabama. He was appointed to be head of the Montgomery bus boycott, involved Rosa Parks. And he had just written his first book called Stride for Freedom about the boycott. He's in New York City at a book signing at none else than Blumstein's department store in Harlem. And a crazed African-American woman runs up to where he is and takes a letter opener and stabs him in the chest. He's only 29, so this is well before his greatest accomplishments were yet to come. So it's lodged in his chest. Everyone's panicked. And this woman, thinking she's going to do the right thing, goes to grab the letter opener and she's going to pull it out. At that same moment, the owner of a jazz club, who used to be a police officer, remembers from his training, his medical training, that if the person's not bleeding, don't pull the knife out. So he grabs her hand just as she's ready to pull the knife out. Says, please don't do that. He's taken to the local hospital, and the x-rays show that the tip of the letter opener was impinging on his aorta. And had he sneezed, had she tried to grab that knife and dislodge it, he probably would have bled to death. There was a minister there, and his words were, "But for the grace of God, we would have lost our leader." How many think that God played a role in that police officer's being there to grab that woman's hand before she pulled out? Good. Lester and Ellen say yes. Jeff says yes. Basha. Wow. Anybody else? Okay. Next story. Gentleman is hiking Mount Rainier with two of his buddies. All of a sudden, the wind starts howling, it gets really cold, and there's a blizzard, and he gets separated from his buddies. The next day, a helicopter's looking for him, and the next day, the snow subsides a little bit, and they find his frozen body. He's got almost no pulse. They rush him to the hospital. The doctor, who had to be a woman head of the team, said he was on the verge of death. At first, they didn't know even to do anything, but they decided to, and they put him on a special machine. I forget that, Karen, you would know, but Jeff, a special machine. And you got to have someone who really knows how to operate it. Then they put him on a ventilator. And 2 days later, he's sitting up in his bed, not needing any assistance. The head of the hospital says he was adding this to his list of God-caused miracles. This man had no business living, and not to be sitting up 2 days later without needing any assistance. His suffered no kidney damage, no lung damage. The woman who was head of the team said she disagreed. She didn't think it had much to do with God. It was the hard work of her team that worked tirelessly for the first 24 hours to keep the person alive. How many think that God played a role in saving this man's life when everybody thought he was going to die? Lester, Ellen, Basha.
I mean, why couldn't it have been both, the doctors and God?
Okay. And Jeff. Okay. But God plays a role. Anybody else think God played a role in it?
Only Ellen in this case. I don't believe it.
Okay. And then the third is from an article that I was in my research for my Devar Torah today by one of the great conservative rabbis in this country. He died 6 years ago. But Rabbi Schulweis in Los Angeles. And he tells a story of a family that it was at Ne'ilah service at his synagogue. And the college-age son says to his parents, you know, I've been here all day with you. I got to break the fast in Malibu. It's an hour drive. Can I leave now? And the parents thought about it and felt a little guilty, but said, yes, you can go. And on the way, he was hit by a drunk driver and killed. His father, man of deep faith, first got very angry with himself and blamed himself for letting his son leave early. Should have stayed for the whole Ne'ilah service. And then was angry with God, thought God may be punishing the son for leaving early. Or how could God let this happen? And Rabbi Schulweis says he wouldn't even talk to me. I was a representative of God in his mind. And I went to comfort him and he wanted nothing to do with me. Did God play a role in that young man's death? Ellen, yes. Anybody else?
My mother would say God punished him.
Okay. I think it's human nature that we're more prone to say God's responsible for the good things that happen, but not for the bad things that happen, although I have known people who do feel that, just what your mother felt, Ellen. It was a punishment. There are people who say that this terrible plague is a punishment from God, that what happened with Hurricane Katrina or with Katrina and all the flooding that happened in New Orleans. So it leads to this whole field, philosophical field of theodicy. Why bad things happen to good people, or why good things happen to good people or to bad people. Our tradition teaches us that God is involved in all of these things that happen, that nothing happens by chance. Everything happens for a reason. If the second paragraph of the Shema, what does it say, Rick? Anybody want to tell us what the second paragraph of the Shema says? Jeff.
If we do X, then God will reward us with rain and sun and make the crops grow, that type of thing.
And what if we don't?
Then I guess the opposite is implied.
It says right there. No, it says God will dry up the heavens and all that stuff. So, and then we have every year in the Torah twice. Jeff usually gets saddled with reading it. The blessings and the curses. If you do X, it's a reward and punishment. It's all throughout the sacred text. We do right, follow God's word, good things will happen. If we don't, if any, and therefore bad things will result. And then there are all these reasons why good things can happen for the merit of our ancestors, it says. It's because we have a kind and loving God, because God is compassionate and forgiving. We can get punished in our tradition even if we don't do anything wrong, because our tradition believed in vicarious atonement. That sometimes we're punished for what our relatives do wrong or others do wrong. We get tested according to our tradition. God tests Abraham. Is he going to really sacrifice his son? The Akedah story, the book of Job. Job's this wonderful person. Anybody familiar with the book of Job? But Satan goes to God and says, let's test this guy, see if he's really so loyal to you. And God takes away his family, his wealth, makes him ill. Some of us have heard God never gives us more than we can handle. It's just to teach us a lesson, to teach us resilience. The list goes on, and I won't take time going through them all. We are never told in our very rarely told in our tradition that things just sometimes happen. That God doesn't cause them, no one else causes them. But sometimes there's a word, happens. The whole notion of theodicy is that if God is an all-loving, all-knowing, all-good God, then how could any of these bad things happen? After the Holocaust, what was the response of many philosophers to how God let the Holocaust happen? Anybody familiar with some of the greatest philosophers? Either God had withdrawn or God was no longer omnipotent. So the question really is then, in all of these examples I gave, how much does God really play in our lives? Is there any room in our tradition to say maybe God doesn't play a role? And the beauty again of our tradition, which I always mention, is probably the most important gift that God gave us, is our mind. It's the first blessing of the 14 blessings of Birkot HaShachar. When we have our 19 petitionary blessings or prayers in the daily Amidah, the first one is your mind, your ability to think. And that's what I want us to just talk about a minute. And a teaching from the Talmud that I'd never seen before, very honestly. I was never taught this until I started my research for today. This is from the tractate Avodah Zarah, idol worship. And here's what the teaching is of the rabbis. If a man steals wheat from another person's field and plants the seeds from that wheat in his own field, and if God is truly a God of justice, then the stolen seed should not grow wheat and flourish. Does that make sense to everybody? If God's a God of justice, and those seeds that were stolen should not flourish. No wheat should grow. And the rabbi's response, however, is Olam lamin hago noheg. Nature pursues its own course. Jill, what do you think they mean by that? Nature pursues its own course.
I go back to what my father used to say, which was, don't ask why, you'll never know the answer. And when you say nature takes its course, it's basically the same thing. You don't know why something happens. So you say nature took its course.
I think
because it's out of our control.
The scholars take a little different view of that. I understand that's possible interpretation, but when nature takes its own course, Does anybody want to offer maybe another interpretation? That's one interpretation, but there's another interpretation. Bill,
I liked Jill's interpretation, and I can't think of anything else. So I'll let you go on to the next person.
okay. Anybody else? Another interpretation. When you say nature takes its own course. In other words, God wears more than one hat. And I'll give you another example. This is from the same teaching in the Talmud. The rabbis offer a second example. If a man forces himself on his neighbor's wife, if God is a God of justice, the woman should not become pregnant. But the rabbis then take almost judicial notice that yes, she will become pregnant because nature pursues its own course. And the teaching is God wears different hats. And one of the hats God wears is the creator God, Elohim. It's the word for God that's used in the first chapter of Genesis when God creates the world. And what happens with that creator God is once God creates, God has no more power over what happens. If God created the plates under the earth and those plates butt up against each other and there's a terrible earthquake, according to this teaching, and I think it's traditional, God has no power over that. And so many things in life happen because nature, once God created the nature, whatever, the world, then the laws of physics take over. The laws of nature take over. And that's what those teachings, I believe, are telling us. Is that even though that wheat was stolen, if you plant seeds, it's an amoral universe. I guess that's the best way those my professors would have said. The universe is amoral. But then fortunately, God wears a different hat. Other hats. One of them is Adonai. And I don't know if we've ever talked about that. I think we have, but how does Adonai differ from Elohim, as it's used in the Torah? They both are this words for God. Adonai is a personal God. It's not an amoral God. It's a God that cares about God's creatures and does get involved. And the God of Adonai wears two hats. Sometimes God wears the hat of justice, and that's punishing God. And the other hat that God wears is rachamim, or compassion. And that's where we get this, sometimes when people when you say, Lester and Ellen, that God is involved and God punishes, and there was a punishment. That's where your mom got it. It's part of our tradition also. That this God has a side, the Adonai side, that does care about how we act and how the world works. Rabbi Schulweis, in his article, explains the difference between these two gods, or the two sides of the same God. And he says the God Elohim lives in a world of is. This is just the way things are. The God Adonai is the world of ought, O-U-G-H-T. It's to live in a universe where we can make a difference, where God can make a difference. And he says the aim of the Shema prayer is to unify these two sides of God. The creator God that created the amoral universe that plays no role, and the God that does care. the God that wants us to be God's partner in bringing peace and serenity and justice to the world. For example, Robin. Even in our own lives, we want to blame. And Rabbi Schulweis points out that when the DNA that we receive from our parents it's just what happens. We have no control over it. What our race or ethnicity is, our religion that we're born into, we have no control over those things. Our sexual orientation, our gender identity, they just are. And I think that's the challenge, and that's how I want to end this. It's for us, it's the serenity prayer. I never realized the beauty of the serenity prayer until I prepared this. And what does the serenity prayer say? It's God, grant me the serenity to accept the things in my life that you can't change and I can't change. But also to give me the courage to work with you as your junior partner. And when there are things that can be changed, like bias and prejudice and income inequality and homophobia, climate change, that's when I don't sit back and just accept. And that's the God of Adonai that doesn't sit back and accept and says, I want you to help me change these things. And then to have the wisdom to know the difference between the two. So going back to that tragic event where the young man is killed by a drunk driver, I would offer that God plays no role in something like that. That was one human being not showing respect for other human beings. The ones where good things happen, I agree, Bill, those that say it's a big question. We'd like to believe that God does play some role, may play some role. But it's where to me, it's what we have the obligation is to make these things happen and not to depend on God or hope that God's going to perform some miracle to make things work for us. It takes us off the hook. Any thoughts, last thoughts or questions?
Well, I believe we're all part of God and we're in the image of God. So therefore, when things happen, whether it's doctors or miracles or whatever that people do, it's really, that's where I believe there's a little bit of God in all of us.
We all have divine, no question. Yes. Somebody else had his or her hand up. Rick.
So there's a story that I heard that in the Middle Ages when there were plagues, there's some people who said, well, it's just the will of God and this is how God is punishing people. And the story that I heard is the Jewish response was, well, we have God gave us the knowledge or the wisdom to try to find ways to treat people and the caring to want to. And if God really wants to punish people, he'll just have to find some other way.
Okay.
I would just like to add that I think at some point it would be nice to have a discussion regarding the dangers of believing things that we can't possibly know.
I'll talk to you about I have an immediate concern, Bill, which is I don't want to be disrespectful at all to people that feel strongly that they do know.
Yes, but a lot of harm has been done by people believing things are true that either aren't true or they can't possibly know. And so I think it's an act of humility to acknowledge what you can't know and know the difference between that and the hope that you have.
So I might reframe that and I'll put an end. I might reframe it to say, it might be good to have a debate as to whether or not you can know. Because there are people that really feel they do know.
And how can you know that? How can you know that there is a God?
I think you can distinguish between having faith. People have strong faith in something that they really believe in, and whether it's and actually true. I don't know that I hear about that, but I have faith, strong faith in something. I think that's legitimate.
Ellen.
Very often you hear that there are tests that, will you get Alzheimer's? Will you get breast cancer? I wouldn't take one of those tests. I don't want to know. I don't want to live thinking, when is it going to happen to me? You know what I mean? I want to think that tomorrow is going to be a little bit better, not worse.
Thank you, Ellen. And again, life is complicated, and we all, I think that's the big thing is, Bill, I hear what you're saying 100%. And there are people that use their blind faith to go out and harm other people. There's no question about it. But there are also people that use their faith to do good things.
Absolutely, but there are also people who often use their faith to think that they're better than other people.
Question about it. And that's the lack of humility. That's where the lack of humility comes in. It's a complicated area. I just think, again, what our tradition teaches us beyond everything is to respect our fellow human beings. It's what Terry on page 70 talks about, is to love. It all comes from love and respect. That's the starting point. But it's an interesting area, and I just wanted people to think about it a little bit. And if you have any more you want to say at another time, or just contact me personally, that'd be great. That'd be great. Okay, I appreciate it.